2025, why does ancient history matter? I've been thinking about this a lot lately because at some point you have to ask yourself, what's the point of studying ancient history? Being able to name the first 7 kings of Rome probably isn't going to help you get a job, although it should. And good luck trying to convince potential employers to hire you based on your history degree, 0 work experience, and thorough understanding of Macedonian phalanx tactics. Ask me how I know about that last part. So other than giving us something to think about while we're stuck in traffic, why bother learning about the Babylonians, ancient Egypt, or the Roman Empire at all? Well, for me, reading about ancient history has been a lifeline. It's kept me sane, it's given me a toolkit for making sense of this chaotic world, and it's helped me wake up with at least some hope, no matter how dark tomorrow might seem. And just to clarify, I'm not saying you need to go to college for ancient history. That's probably not wise in terms of financial ROI. But you can get a grasp on almost everything you need with just a library card and a JSTOR account. To me, trying to make sense of the modern world without any grasp of ancient history feels like trying to understand how a tree grows by studying just the leaves while ignoring the roots and the trunk. Modern arts, culture, technology, and politics, they've shot off in so many different ways that you spend a lifetime studying the leaves and branches of these topics and barely have grasped a fraction of the whole thing. But what if you were to take a look at the tree's trunk and then examine the roots, and only then take a look at a few of the leaves and branches? I think you'd have a much better understanding how everything fits together. Ancient history is like a shortcut to understanding how we live today. The ancients are still with us in so much of our current world, even if some of the connections don't seem obvious to us at first glance. None of the structures that we take for granted today sprang up overnight. Law, science, medicine, and politics, these were gradually built on top of the foundations laid by the ancients. We're still making heavy use of ancient ideas and concepts in all of those fields. That's clear to see with obvious examples like democracy or republicanism. But if we wonder how our modern democracy can be so corrupt and chaotic, we only need to take a look at ancient Athens, where things were so chaotic, corrupt, and unstable that their democracy barely survived for 180 years. Now, our legal system is in debt to Rome, to Hammurabi's Code, and others. It's interesting to see in some respects how little we've evolved from just scrawling laws on stone tablets and punishing those who don't conform. But when we dig into ancient history, we quickly find out that progress is rarely linear. 300 years before Hammurabi's Code made an eye for an eye into law, the Sumerians were following the laws of Ur-Nammu. By comparison, the older Sumerian laws seem almost progressive. Instead of brutal physical punishments, the emphasis on fines and restitution and taking care of the vulnerable in society, like widows and orphans. It's fascinating to see which concepts are universally protected and how they vary across cultures and different eras. I think this distinction helps us clarify what is fundamentally moral and just, as opposed to what is merely a product of custom or tradition. Ancient history lends context to modern practices that are difficult to understand in isolation. It also helps us better understand the systems that we might otherwise take for granted. Here's a good example. Most people of all denominations accept religion without giving a second thought to the way monotheism was grafted onto pagan rituals, or where ideas about the afterlife came from in the first place, or how religious schism and shifts often had more to do with preserving political power than the salvation of their followers. Seeing religion evolve over thousands of years, it's changed my perception and understanding, and might do the same for others. And this applies to all the major religions. You don't have to trust me. Dig into the religious practices of the ancients, as many great authors and researchers have done, and you'll see the antecedents of beliefs and rituals that are still practiced today under different names and different gods. Maybe that's just a coincidence. Maybe the ancients had it all wrong, and only today we figured it all out. But we should certainly take time to appreciate that the rituals and symbols in use today, they often had origins that might seem out of character with how they're used today in many major religions. People dismiss ancient history because it's so remote from our present, but that's exactly why we should pay attention to the ancient world. Since it's so remote from our present day, we can view it with at least a small degree of detachment. Because many of those civilizations have run their course, we can learn about them with the 2020 vision of hindsight. We can work backwards from the decline and fall, and then try to make sense of what all went wrong. Cause and effect are so much plainer for us to see in many cases. Now, this doesn't always happen in practice, but I think in general, it's becoming easier to suspend our biases and prejudices when we look at the ancient world. Because when we study the ancient world now, as opposed to, say, in the 1800s, there's probably less projection going on. There's maybe less wishful thinking, and hopefully less romanticizing of the past going on. But this also tells us something about ourselves. How we view ancient history and have viewed it over time gives us an insight into the Renaissance, into Victorian England, and even into the trenches of World War I, where the soldier poet's work is often filled with ancient literary references. And because there are far fewer trunks than leaves, we can really dig deep to critically examine and scrutinize some of these topics, and that actually increases our understanding of more topics. Here's a fun fact. For many ancient civilizations and famous rulers, the only substantial sources we have were written by their enemies. Now, history is written by the victors. We've all heard this, and it's true most of the time. But the victors don't just write history. They often stamp out the history of the people they've conquered. If we want to know about ancient Carthage, we often have to rely on their bitter enemies, the Romans. When Rome besieged Carthage in the 140s BC and eventually took the city, the destruction was devastating. Even though the Romans didn't actually salt the earth, libraries were looted, and lots of Carthaginian writing was lost. But with the Punic Wars, we're lucky to at least have multiple sources, one of which, Polybius, was a somewhat neutral observer as a Greek. Now going farther back, like with the Gutians, for example, the only written evidence we have of that ancient people's existence is a handful of mentions from their enemies, who are probably not going to be the most unbiased sources around. Of course, the Akkadians, Sumerians, and Assyrians all accused them of being barbarians who only brought death and destruction. Now, to get a more complete picture of the Hittites, we turn to the Egyptians, occasionally an ally, often an enemy. Well-known and obscure civilizations alike are largely understood through the eyes of their rivals or their conquerors. When the Spanish conquered large portions of the Americas, they burned the books that they deemed pagan or sacrilegious, and in the process, they destroyed vast amounts of Mayan and other cultures' records. Even within the same empire or civilization, Rome, for example, political opponents are often the only sources we have for the lives of their rivals. Before we can start to make sense of almost anything in the ancient world, we have to first consider who is writing about what and how their biases or connections might influence their perceptions. What's the writer's real agenda? When we read Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, for example, which is an autobiographical account of his wars in Gaul, we need to remember that Caesar was writing all this to convince the senators back in Rome that this 9-year war was definitely justified, and that Caesar was a hero, and just overall a great Roman guy. As one historian has written, Caesar was not actually a historian. He was a political warlord in need of good public relations material to confuse both his friends and enemies in Rome about the true nature of his activities in Gaul. And for many of Caesar's activities outside Rome, guess what? Caesar is the only source we have. So with ancient history, it's crucial to assess the motivation of the author. Does he attempt to be impartial? Does he even claim to be? Is there a vendetta? Are there family bonds or history or politics that put the writers at odds with their subject? In ancient history, you have to ask all these questions all the time. We have to know the answers to truly understand what happened and why. Things aren't so different today in that regard. And ancient history is critical training for critical reading. So many people read what is presented before them and just accept it as fact on virtually any subject. We're all guilty of this. I know I am. But ancient history trains your mind. It trains you to ask questions, to interrogate authors, even though they've been dead for thousands of years. It teaches you how to tear apart a text and how to fight for ideas. But the beauty and challenge of studying ancient history is that not only are many sources wildly biased, but we also have few, if any, texts about so many important topics. Even for the best documented and most literate civilizations, there are relatively few sources available to scholars about large stretches of history. And if there are any sources at all, odds are that they only concern the most urbanized areas or the capital. There's a tension and a divide in Roman and Greek sources between the sophisticated city dweller and the rural landowner or farmers. Another layer of bias to consider. But all that means in most cases is that the same handful of ancient texts have been dissected by brilliant minds for hundreds of years. You would think there would be nothing left to say, nothing new at all. But I'm still amazed by the insights and shades of nuance that the best ancient historians can bring to light about topics we thought we knew everything there was to know. The same body of sources in one scholar's hands can be interpreted very differently in another's. A perfect example is Emperor Caligula. The third emperor of Rome is portrayed as an evil, raving lunatic, and that's the exact conclusion that historian Arthur Farrell comes to in his 1991 biography of Caligula. Caligula was an immature, mad tyrant who was drunk with power and was evil. But then again, maybe Caligula was just misunderstood in many of the ways you might expect from a 24-year-old who lived essentially as a hostage of the previous emperor, Tiberius. Caligula then inherited an outmoded system that pitted a disgruntled senatorial elite against the emperor. And that's exactly what Anthony Barrett writes in his 1998 study of Caligula. The sources didn't change in 7 years, but the attention paid to the evidence and the interpretation of it did change. So which one is correct? I have my feelings on the matter, which I've explained thoroughly in another video that I'll link to in the comments below. But ultimately, it's up to you to decide. Read widely, weigh the evidence, and decide who has the stronger argument, who has the better sources and evidence, and who interprets them in a more logical way. Critical thinking is key to ancient history. Now here's something to think about. Kadesh is one of the first battles in history that we have sources from both sides for. And yet, in their records afterward, both the Hittites and the Egyptians claimed victory. It might seem like ancient history is less relevant today because it's so far removed from our present. But I'd argue it's exactly the opposite. Think about Marshall McLuhan's idea of the global village. McLuhan argued that the modern communication technologies that connect us so closely, they make it feel like we're all living in a small, tightly knit community. Events in one place instantly affect everyone else in another place. Technology and social media have made us more like our ancient ancestors who relied on oral transmission, kinship networks, and word of mouth. McLuhan talked about how the youth were becoming more tribal and less privacy-minded than older generations. And this was back in the 1960s. And he refers to youth attempting to make sense of the world through mythology. So this is why ancient history is a key to understanding our present. The linear approach to history and life that worked in the past, it doesn't seem to fit a world where seeing and hearing are believing, whether it's through videos, podcasts, or social media feeds. And even that is now being challenged by AI and deepfakes. So in this context, it's incredibly valuable to us now to understand how societies back then that relied on seeing and hearing as believing, how did they function? How did they rise and fall? How were they manipulated into war, and how did they broker peace? How did tyrants rise to power, and how were they overthrown? Most importantly, how did people in these cultures make sense of their world? Because guess what? We're constantly being told that technology is creating a world today that is unprecedented in human history. In some ways, of course, that's true. But isn't it interesting that we have this entire compendium of human experience from a time when wealth inequality was so extreme that it offended the gods, at a time when a small group of nobles owned absolutely everything, religion was used to consolidate power and confuse the people people either had no conception of the written word or they hadn't learned to trust it yet. Back then, what mattered wasn't the ability to write things down, but the ability to project ideas through speech and prove one's leadership through spectacle. This was an era when most lived in small villages and towns, relying on extended social networks to understand the ancient world. So no, ancient history isn't a perfect one-to-one for today's challenges, but a firm grasp of it can absolutely help you understand the present day. In our present moment, how often are we told that the latest war, epidemic, political upheaval, or catastrophe is the worst ever? The world must be a terrifying place to the people who believe that. But if you know your history, then you know that for the most part, we have seen this all before, and we have survived. Humans fought wars of annihilation long before the atom bomb. Politicians have always made promises to the people that they had no intention of keeping. The plague of Justinian devastated the Roman Empire. We survived all that and more with a fraction of the science and understanding that we have today. So having a grasp of ancient history helps insulate you from the insanity of the modern news cycle. Most of what we're told is the worst thing ever is obviously surpassed by what the ancients endured with only their myths to comfort them. Isn't it strange how writers who have been dead for 2,000 or 3,000 years can still speak to us today? How can that be? Well, it's simple, of course. It's cliche even. But the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's a curse, and it's a comfort. It can be demoralizing to look at the ancient world and think how little progress we've made. In some facets of life, arguably we've even regressed perhaps. But in other areas like human rights and obviously slavery, we've made great strides, although mostly only in recent centuries. But the human condition remains, and we ask ourselves the same questions as our ancestors. Why am I here? What is the purpose of life? What is the good life? And despite our material advantages today, we face many of the same challenges as 2,500 years ago. Our politicians and leaders are corrupt, our merchants are greedy, the artists of today feel inconsequential compared to the greats of the past. And we worry that younger generations are worse off than their elders, and we complain about the difficulty of finding a suitable life partner. But these afflictions are timeless, and guess what? So are the remedies. Take a tour of modern self-help books or personal development YouTubers, and you'll find that the majority of their advice comes from the ancients, just in updated packaging. Much of the advice being handed out today is just repackaged Marcus Aurelius or Zen or Taoism. There's nothing wrong with that. That's culture. But subsequent iterations need to bring something new or offer a compelling reason for themselves. It could be something as simple as updating a language. That's what creatives have always done. But it's something to keep in mind when someone tries to sell you a cure that's available for free. Having exposure to the originals is going to help you filter out a lot of noise today. In his Meditations, Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, he reflects on the challenges of leadership even as he led his empire through war. He wrote about the frustrations of dealing with difficult colleagues, how to manage stress, motivate the lazy, negotiate with the greedy, and navigate the vanity and insecurities of those around him. His insights are strikingly modern, showing that the struggles of leadership, whether in ancient Rome or a modern office, are relatively timeless. And it's a reminder, to me especially, that even an emperor with all of his power had to grapple with the same interpersonal challenges that we face today. Think about this. Over 1800 years ago in ancient China, Lu Qi wrote Wen Fu, or The Art of Writing. It's one of the greatest guides to writing ever composed. Lu Qi was a military leader and a poet, and he understood the creative struggles that still plague writers today. Where to find inspiration, how to conquer the fear of the blank page, and how to hone one's craft. Despite his experience leading armies, huge armies, Lu Qi was most captivated by the power of writing and art, and his work is a testament to the enduring nature of creative challenges and the universal quest to master the art of expression. Both Marcus Aurelius and Lu Qi, they remind us that human experience, whether it's in leadership, creativity, or personal growth, transcends time and place by thousands of years. A few months ago, I drove to work on a gray, rainy day. As I drove up the 5 floors of the parking garage in my office building, I felt lower and lower. There was a pile of work waiting for me, and none of it was all that meaningful in the grand scheme of things. And I knew I'd be cooped up under artificial lighting all day without being able to step outside for a break. I think we all have days like this. So I sat there in my car for a few minutes trying to motivate myself for the long work day ahead. Then a funny thing happened. It hit me. I'm descended from pyramid builders and emperors, gladiators and slaves, seafarers and desert explorers, farmers and hunters. And I thought about who came before them. Because if you're alive right now, then your existence is miraculous, and it can be traced back to the lineage of heroes and gods. I felt a little better, and then I felt a little silly. But I realized a second later that even that brief thought experiment had precedent in the ancient world too. Why should I feel silly for doing what people have always done? For seeking the same comfort people have always sought, dating back to the first written words. Ancient peoples around the world have always done this. The ancient Greeks all traced their lineage back to Hercules, or through the Iliad to another hero, all while sitting in a country shack far outside Athens, or while standing in an overgrown field in Thrace. Just like I was doing in a parking garage in an office tower in 2024. Modern life has a way of shrinking your world. It's easy to forget when you're sitting in traffic or scrolling through endless social media feeds that you are part of something bigger. But here's the truth. You are the latest chapter in an epic story, and that story isn't over yet.